Well, hello everyone. I hope you are doing well. This was originally going to be an episode of the Big L podcast. I have some news to share with you about that venture, but for now it's going up on Pink Flame of Liberty. And what is our subject today? Voluntary slavery. Yay! Okay, I am still learning the eCam software, but I'm doing better, and I'm going to get a Stream Deck, which should help things immensely. And I definitely am going to need to drink for this subject. Alrighty, let's just get down to it. This has actually been a long time coming. In my wild, wacky, busy world of being LP secretary, it's been put on the back burner. This topic was originally requested, not using those exact terms. Of course, I was being a bit sensationalistic in the intro, but this was requested by a patron, Clayton Casasio. Don't come for me, bro. I mangle your name every time. Why did I think somehow it rhymed with mascara? And there is no way. Casasio. Well, in any event, I can't figure out how to get it to rhyme with mascara. And I had that in my mind for some reason. But I'm finally making good on my obligation to you. Clayton is a fellow Libertarian Party of Colorado member who faced a very similar path to anarchy that I did. In fact, we were in the same local group.
My name's Danny, and I'm an alcoholic.
It was the Douglas County Libertarian Party with one Jay North, who was an advocate of that view and basically would not let us forget it. And I mean that in the nicest way possible, but he continually challenged our views. And I can remember some of the answers I used to give to his challenges. They are just
such as in South Africa and the Iraq, everywhere such as.
I cringe today. But Clayton and I followed, I think, a very similar path, starting out as small government, constitutional minarchists, and, before you knew it was a little bit longer than 6 months, but before you knew it, hello, anarchy, right?
Give me your position. Show me where the ammunition is.
So, and we've also served on several platform committees together. His question did, though, have ultimately to do with that perennial libertarian chestnut where we like to get into the weeds of voluntary slavery. And by calling it a chestnut, I'm not trying to diminish or belittle the question. It's actually a very valid and I think a very difficult question that many libertarians don't want to think about.
No way.
Or they just think it's just so out there that it's just not worth their thoughts, or they're scared of it. I don't know. I think it's a little bit of all of that because it does require some thoughtful, heavy lifting. It is not really outside the realm of possibility. To me, it's not on the level of what I like to give as the outrageous libertarian question is, do one of a set of conjoined twins have the right to commit suicide if the other one doesn't want to? Answer is no. Anyway, it's not like that question, but more plausible, I think, if you are dealing with Libertopia and everything basically is the free market. And me, being the obsessive compulsive autist that I am, I have worried over this problem. Like a dog with a bone.
Whoa!
Quite some time ago, actually, in kind of the beginning of my libertarian journey. And I'm more than willing to visit it now. I hope I can do it justice. Sometimes I have things in my head that don't necessarily come out my mouth in the most graceful way possible. That's what the beer is for. Hopefully that will help. And sometimes my problems with philosophical concerns, I really can intuit the answer and I do grok it instinctively, but as I said, I do struggle sometimes to adequately express it in words. If only we had invented thought-to-thought transfer by now, like when you bump the cell phones together to get contact information, boom chakalaka, like that. But alas, like flying cars, we do not have thought-to-thought transfer, so here's the imperfect medium that we have to deal with. So when Clayton wrote me about the question he wanted me to address, and he was able to insist upon that because anyone who is a $25 a month patron, even if for just 1 month, or if you're for multiple months, then you get to stockpile the questions to me. I say, hey, if there's something that I think I can tackle and there's something you want me to tackle, have me tackle it. And Clayton has been patient as a saint because he asked this before Rona, and then the whole world basically went to shit. So when I repeated the question back to him in order to be sure I understood what he was asking, the way I worded it was, so basically you would like a discussion on the extent of alienability. And he concurred that I was perhaps more correct in my wording, which was a more technical wording rather than, how about that voluntary slavery, bro, because it really does get to the heart of the issue. So, in other words, the first apparent question that comes up is, to what extent can you voluntarily alienate your own rights? And I think our initial reaction, or if that was like the only question in isolation, I think that most libertarians, myself included, would just sharply say, well, as much as you want, right? I do what I want. I'm a libertarian. If they're my rights, I can do with them what I want, right? What is, in fact, ownership of anything if you can't divest yourself of ownership? But there actually is the paradox to me of the question. And there is not libertarian agreement on this, but I'm fairly confident and comfortable in the conclusion that I have come to. So let me lay out some of the questions we will need to explore. And these aren't in any particular order. It's kind of stream of consciousness, and sometimes my stream overfloweth. So the first extreme of the stream, as it were, would be the position that your rights are utterly inalienable. And that is at least what a cursory reading of our Declaration of Independence would seem to categorically state. And that absolutely no action of yourself or anyone else can change that. They're your rights and you're stuck with them. Now, to some, that sounds very attractive. To me, there is a lurking horror there, though, that isn't exclusive to this extreme. There's many linking horrors in this discussion. But if your rights were utterly and absolutely inalienable, well, what about punishment for crime? Could there ever really be any punishment for crime? Because when you punish a criminal, you are infringing upon his rights in some way, and you're claiming it's a justified infringement, which means, at least to some extent, that criminal has alienated their rights. And not even criminal, we can even get into some kind of civil issues of any kind of enforced restitution. But keeping with crime, for example, if you commit a heinous crime, what justification would there be to imprison you and thus alienate you of at least some of your rights? And it will not do to proverbially kick the can down the road and claim that in a truly libertarian society, there would not be punitive justice encompassing imprisonment, but rather just restitution. because that really doesn't answer the question, because is not restitution also a form of forced labor, thus alienation of some of your rights, or at least seizure of fruits of voluntary labor, which again is an alienation of rights, or tracking another track, or streaming another stream? Do you, for instance, not have the right to commit suicide? Isn't that the ultimate alienation of your rights? Or can you not sell your kidney, for instance? Isn't that alienating the right to your body in some way permanently? So ultimately, I think that this extreme of utterly inalienable rights under any circumstance seems to deny self-ownership entirely, and also, to me, denies justice. It sounds horrible. It sounds absolutely and utterly dystopian, to be honest with you. So what then is the other extreme? Well, that would be that your rights are utterly alienable. But to me, this presents a horror of a different kind. For instance, something as simple as getting a tattoo often leads to regret. We've seen some very regrettable tattoos. So just with that circumstance in mind, do you really want the right or the ability? I mean, is it a good thing to be able to sell yourself into irrevocable slavery at some moment in time? You travel through time as an entire person, and you don't remain the same. Permanent decisions of such weight, to me, are simply incompatible with the human condition. And let me qualify that by saying permanent peaceful decisions of such weight are simply incompatible with the human condition, because you could even say that there's been split decisions in time, such as when somebody murders somebody, that you end up paying for the rest of, the criminal's life. So, but that's not a peaceful decision. So I did want to qualify that. But there are some peaceful, permanent decisions I actually do think you should be able to make, like, for instance, suicide. I do think you have a right to suicide, which, again, is the ultimate alienation of rights. But the reason I think that's an exception, and why I think that's an allowable alienation, is because by virtue of the nature of what the thing is, you're killing yourself, there isn't any more travel through time. I mean, that's the end point. You terminate literally any further growth. So I suppose if there were some way to set yourself in stone at the moment of any such decision, such as irrevocable slavery, and to guarantee that you'll remain the same into perpetuity, then my objection would vanish. But I would question if you would really be human at that point. Because libertarian theorists do talk about, like, what if there was a zombification operation? Couldn't you then irrevocably alienate your rights? And I'd say, yeah, but you're no longer yourself. A zombie isn't you. It would be the equivalent to committing suicide, but with your body remaining alive. Because honestly, if you could, and it could in fact be possible at some point, give complete control of your will to another person, then you, as you, in my view, would cease to exist. Forget about selling a kidney. Can you today sell your heart? But when the time comes for you to give up the goods, can you change your mind? Or have you alienated the right to do that? We're going to get to the answer, but I would say no. You haven't alienated the right, and you can change your mind. That there are certain kinds of decisions that you can change your mind about, and that a mere promise to do something isn't an aggression that can be enforced. And we do intuitively recognize that in many other areas that I'll be getting to. Of course, people could raise the specter then of detrimental reliance, but detrimental reliance is a theory that requires reasonableness. It's not reasonable to detrimentally rely on somebody giving up their heart. You take the risk that they could change their mind. All right, so now that we dealt with both extremes, I think after dealing with both extremes, sussing this out, we have apprehended a potential answer that actually, in my opinion and in my view, is the only one that honors libertarian free will. And that's the view that holds consent to be paramount and continuous consent, continuous free consent. And the very nature of consent is that it can always be withdrawn. The minute you say it cannot be withdrawn, and that the mere withdrawal of consent justifies permanent aggression against you, it's a contradiction. It's a logical impossibility. Consent ultimately is not alienable. That is what is in fact not alienable. I think talking about rights deflects the issue. What we're really getting to is whether your consent is alienable. Your peaceful consent is alienable. And yes, I know someone can say, well, you did consent at one point, and that is an excellent point, but we don't recognize that in, well, you said you'd have sex now, so I can rape you 10 minutes from now if you've changed your mind. We intuit that that's not good. That's not right.
And remember, consent can always be retracted. So if you feel like the vibes have kind of changed or you're unsure, getting mixed signals, you want to check in.
That's not just. So my conclusion to the answer is that continuous consent of peaceful people is not alienable. And adding the qualifier, I know I'm beating this dead horse, the qualifiers of peaceful and continuous are the key. Why? First, about peaceful. You know, when I first stated it, I said consent is not alienable. And I did mean that consent of everyone, peaceful people and aggressors alike. But once the aggression is committed, that is a consent to the consequences. This gets a bit into the argumentation ethics. I'm not a fan of Hoppe, but I do think that his argumentation ethics are airtight. I do think that also brings in, as Stephan Kinsella has argued, certain issues of estoppel. So you can't argue that aggression against you is improper to be done to you because you've already proven by your actions of aggression against others that you don't believe that. You've estopped the right of yourself to make that argument. So once the aggression is committed, that is ultimately a consent to the consequences, with limits, of course, depending upon the actual aggressive action. So let's take some examples. Person A maims person B, negligently or purposefully. Person B had a natural right not to be maimed. So person A must pay a proportional cost. And no, we're not saying you give them your eyeball, because that really does not make the person whole. And we could argue about what is a proportional cost, but I think we should all be able to agree that proportionality is required. But let's contrast this to a mere promise. Person A promises to marry person B. Person B does not have a natural right to be married to person A. But they do have a right to enter into a contract. Perhaps a ring is given or other benefits. And then it's that contract that was breached, not some right. The marriage is not something that the other person is entitled to. Person A cannot be compelled to marry person B if they no longer consent. But person B is entitled to some remedy, but they're not entitled to specific performance. Specific performance is a legal term saying there was an act of your body or your will that you can be compelled to do. When it comes down to mere promises and nothing else, well, sometimes you get the girl and sometimes you don't. So when it comes to something to be given to another that there's no natural right to have, alternative damages can be contractually assessed, but specific performance can't because consent is not continuous. And those sorts of acts of using your body is something that requires it in a different way than having to give up some of your property doesn't. As I've often said in the abortion debate, even though I am ultimately pro-life, your womb is not the same as a patio. We are dealing with different kinds of ownership when we're dealing with ownership of things outside of yourself and ownership of your body and your will. And they cannot and are not treated the same way because of the way you come into ownership of these things. How do you come to own yourself? You come to own yourself simply by existing, simply by being born with a will into that body. You come to own external things through contract, through being the first appropriator. We all know the libertarian theories, and that's an entirely different means. It's not something that's already inherent to yourself. So I would say these sorts of scenarios are very situation specific. And of course, there are also duties of mitigation and the like. I'm going to give a brief example because this is the one that always comes to my mind. So if specific performance cannot be compelled, can it be partially compelled? It depends. And this kind of does almost touch upon some aspects of the abortion debate, because this is the example that people use. If you are a pilot and you voluntarily take a bunch of people up into the air, you have an obligation to finish that flight. That is a specific performance of a very limited kind. You can't change your mind halfway through and parachute out because those people detrimentally relied upon you reasonably with their lives, and you at least have to get them to a point of safety. And that is that is a certain kind of obligation that you have. So now to circle around back to our main question. Voluntary slavery. It's an oxymoron. Slavery is not voluntary. But let's not quibble, because actually what people are saying, do you have the right to alienate yourself into involuntariness, to put it inelegantly? Voluntary permanent servitude maybe is a better way to put it. But the rub is in the word voluntary, because it must be voluntary when made and voluntary for every single moment after that. The minute it becomes involuntary, then it's simply slavery. And that does bring up a lot of weeds to get into. The idea of self-ownership has been criticized because it's been said that the owner must be separate from the thing that is owned. But to me, that's ipse dixit. That might be true for externalities, but why would we assume? And actually, I think our intuition tells us that that's not true for existence. And in some sense, I would say that the owner is actually the will, which is a non-physical thing. It's the you that is you. It's the there that is there. And the body and everything controlled by the will is the property. The will isn't the property. The will is separate from the property. So the will owns the property, which is your body. And your will can only be enslaved through aggression. And defaulting on an agreement for permanent servitude is not aggression, since no one can expect such a commitment. Detrimental reliance and expectations of a performance must be reasonable. And if someone bargains for this contract where they're going to give you $1 million, an agreement for you agreeing to forever be their slave, they know that they're taking the risk that at one point you can refuse. And if they try to force you into that, then they are aggressing against you. But they could seek the $1 million plus interest back. So as much as libertarians love certainty and black and white, yes and no answers, social norms and customs will always come into play as to what is reasonable. That even comes into play when we talk about how you come to own property. How much labor do you need to mix with the land to homestead something? You can't piss into the Atlantic Ocean and claim you own the Atlantic Ocean.
Come on, man.
At one extreme. And those social norms can and do change. But in this case, the will lives in the body. If the will cannot be permanently alienated, then neither can the body. And this is one reason why I do reject capital punishment. The body is property, but again, as I said, it's a different sort of property than your backyard shed. Murray Rothbard's title transfer of property is on point on this, I believe, in which he does argue that mere promises are generally not enforceable contracts because there has to be some kind of consideration. And the modern practice of consideration is charade in most cases. If you've ever looked at a real estate contract, it says, for $1 in other valuable consideration.
Come on, man.
$1, really? You can list it as $1, and that's consideration for $1 million house. Alrighty then, right? No. In libertarian theory, there must be some meaningful transfer of title, and you can't transfer title to your body. Though arguably, there's some sort of transfer of title in the $1 example, but I don't think it's reasonable. Your will, absent a zombification operation, cannot agree to stop using your body. Perhaps one day there'll be options where you could transfer your will to go live in a computer. You can live elsewhere and give up your body, but that's not today. And this is the conclusion I came to prior to even knowing Rothbard's view, who, of course, as usual, argued it much better than I can. And in this point, on this particular debate, I agree utterly with Stephan Kinsella. And he stated the question answered by Rothbard. What argument does he produce to show that our bodies are not alienable? Like other libertarians, and I am quoting Kinsella here, like other libertarians, Rothbard in essence argues that slavery or other personal service contracts are not enforceable because there's a sort of logical impossibility involved in voluntarily alienating one's rights to one's body. It's literally impossible to transfer one's actual will to another. So a promise to do so is null and void. You cannot transfer title to your will. It's like contracting to sell the sun. You don't own the sun. Any contract with an impossible object is null and void from the outset and unenforceable. Kinsella quibbles in some points on Rothbard's reasoning, but he comes to the same conclusions a different way. I more agree with Rothbard's reasonings, but since the conclusion is the same, I'm not going to quibble on these fine details, and I certainly won't lose sleep over it. In Kinsella's fuller defense of what he calls moderate, I think he calls it, maybe I just call it, he might have called it something else, but it's basically moderate alienability. We both reject that word gets me. We both reject utter alienability and utter inalienability and kind of come to a middle ground and say it depends. And in that paper, in that argument, I have absolutely nothing to quibble over. Now, what I'll note, and it does somewhat surprise me, Dr. Walter Block disagrees. He believes in utter alienability. And he has said that only he and Nozick, and that surprises me. I would need to read Nozick on this subject because, in what I have read from him, I cannot picture him consistently arguing for utter alienability. But according to Dr. Block, only he and Nozick have advocated for a libertarian legitimacy of selling yourself into slavery. Now, I'll put some of these resources that I referred to into the show notes, but please note that these are papers I've had on my hard drive because, as I said, I got into this subject probably within a couple months of becoming a libertarian because it bothered me. And, OCD can be a blessing and a bitch. So I do not know if they're necessarily available on the internet. I don't even remember where I got each and every one of them. For instance, if you write Dr. Block, he is very generous with his time and resources. I could have gotten some of these things directly from him. So what does Dr. Block do to justify, and this is going to be very brief, utter alienability? For instance, he gives the example that you can sell your love and friendship. Can you really? He notes that you might not actually love or care for the buyer of your love and friendship, but you can pretend, and it's functionally the same thing. And who knows, you might grow to love and care for the buyer. Stockholm syndrome is a thing. So what was pretend can grow to be genuine. But I think that ultimately undermines a pretty fundamental view of contracts and alienability, that you can only contract out or alienate something that actually exists, not something that might exist. I can't sell you the Eiffel Tower because perhaps one day I will own it. I mean, it's not impossible. Or even something more reasonable that I don't presently own, particularly if there's no clear and likely path that I will, in fact, own it. And in fact, Dr. Block argues, in contradiction to the position, which is also my position, that you are your will. He argues, well, you can consent to a frontal lobotomy and bammo, you've surrendered your will. First, I'm going to be a bit pedantic. Lobotomies don't actually do that in most cases. There are people, unfortunately, who were subjected to them because it was a cure for a shit ton of stuff not that long ago, who are walking around in society today perfectly in still ownership of their will and their bodies. They are not zombies. You may know somebody with a perfectly intact will that had one of these in the more brutal period of psychiatry. There are interviews of such people on YouTube. I've watched them. And again, he brings up the idea that there could be some drug or zombie pill that will allow that to happen. And certainly, I think that's actually likely to be possible at some point. If something can be done, man will find a way to do it. But as I said before, and I just fundamentally disagree with him, at that point, your will no longer meaningfully exists. And because there is no will, you gave up your ability to change your mind. As long as you have the ability to change your mind, you can change your mind. Much like the example of suicide. And then, in this view, there's not an issue for punishing aggressors, for their inherent rights are not alienated. They are justly countered with force. We sometimes make the mistake of arguing that force against people is always bad, but it's not. There is just use of force, and that would be one such example. Dr. Block, to me, I believe, seems to disagree, but I find it to be circular. Block, in quoting Williamson Evers, says that Evers says, the natural fact that each human is the proprietor of his own will, and to take rights like those of property and contractual freedom that are based on a foundation of the absolute self-ownership of the will, and then to use those derived rights to destroy their own foundation is philosophically invalid. I agree with Mr. Evers. Contrary to Evers, Dr. Block says that property and contractual freedom are not predicated on the absolute self-ownership of the will, and that indeed to put matters in that way is to assume proven the very issue under contention. But nearly everything comes down to foundational presumptions. Dr. Block, in another article, unless I'm remembering incorrectly, actually states that you don't have to prove that aggression is bad. You don't have to prove the non-aggression principle. It's foundational and assumed by the very act of making assertions and claiming rights. That it again boils down to argumentation ethics. But he doesn't see how that, in fact, I think, disproves his case on voluntary slavery. So every philosophy is going to come down to foundational presuppositions. We all agree with the law of non-contradiction, but we don't prove it because you can't. It's assumed in the whole premise of being able to make logical arguments to begin with. So the question always is, are these presuppositions reasonable, and if provable things flow from those presuppositions? Every discipline comes down to foundational presuppositions. And this brings to mind from my Christian days presuppositional apologetics, which I do think within the rubric of Christianity when speaking to other Christians does in fact have merit. I don't think necessarily it has the merit its advocates think it does when they're dealing with non-believers, but that's a whole other thing. But for instance, in the very thing of us talking to each other where we're assuming there's a you there, there's a there, I can't prove I'm not a brain in a vat. You can't prove you're not a brain in a vat. But there's a great deal of evidence that you're not. And there's even good reason to decide it doesn't really matter. Dr. Bloch then, reminiscent of something Nozick did himself in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, the book that turned me into an anarchist, though its purpose was for an entirely different goal. He then engages in quite the circle himself by saying, and this is close to a quote, I believe, he says, "Neither can I accept Rothbard's contention that if the slave later changed his mind and the master enforced his slavery by violence, the slavery would not then be voluntary. On the contrary," says Dr. Bloch, "it would still be voluntary in that the slave signed a contract which allowed the master to whip him for disobedience and received an amount of money agreeable to him for taking on this role." But here's the circle Dr. Bloch is engaging in. He is simply assuming that such a contract is possible and allowable in order to prove it's possible and allowable. And it doesn't pass the reasonableness test of foundational presuppositions. It's nowhere near that level. And Dr. Bloch also anticipates some arguments and says, well, what if the slave master orders the slave to murder person C? And he gets around that by saying the slave master can only make proper orders, and it's never a proper order to murder somebody. But that's another circle, because is it a proper order to say you must remain my slave after you no longer agree? I can just as easily say it's never proper to order someone to continue to serve in specific performance after he withdraws his consent. So, in conclusion to this somewhat freeform discussion that I hope was helpful in some way, I'm kind of just talking through it, though I believe I've made my conclusion, my personal conclusion, pretty clear that I fall in the moderate alienability camp. I'm going to say some things that some people may take as harsh or perhaps some kind of purity spiral, but it's intended to be neither. There are many kinds of libertarians, and just because I reject one conclusion does not mean I'm making any such idiotic claim that someone holding a conclusion I don't agree with is not a libertarian. First of all, and this could be the subject of another show, I actually don't believe people are libertarian. I think ideas are. There isn't one person on earth, maybe that perhaps there is, but I've never met them, that are consistently libertarian in absolute everything. It's ideas that are libertarian, not people. So I respect Dr. Bloch greatly. In fact, he's probably the libertarian philosopher and writer that I respect the most. Certainly, he is out of those presently alive, with Kinsella a close second, though on this subject, Kinsella is far superior. If I added in those people now dead, Dr. Bloch might even be in a tie with Rothbard, and I freaking love Rothbard hard, okay?
Boom, chicka, wow, wow.
And sometimes things simply come down to a moral intuition, in my view. Reals before feels absolutism only works for androids and Vulcans. It does not work for human beings as much as we would like to pretend otherwise, Mr. Shapiro. For example, when I first heard that Rothbard argued that there is no duty to feed your infant children. My first reaction, and I believe it was a correct reaction, was that if this is the logical outcome of libertarianism, you can take libertarianism and shove it up your ass. I want nothing to do with such a monstrous philosophy. I pretty much have the same reaction to the idea that a libertarian society would enforce slave contracts, complete with slave catchers and whippings. If that is what libertarianism is, I don't want a damn thing to do with it. That isn't, again, to say those who I believe come to the wrong conclusion on that all of their other conclusions are bad. But that is my visceral reaction. To me, if libertarianism entails or implies anything, it must imply the absolute sanctity of the non-aggressive will. And it is definitionally not aggression to make decisions about the disposition of your body and to change your mind and to be able to change your mind. You always have the absolute right to change your mind about such dispositions. So for me, that's the long and short of it. Good people, good solid libertarians will disagree, but I'd still ultimately maintain that that idea is monstrous, and I would urge them to change their mind. There was something I had said on Face Beast. Let me see if I can pull it up, and I completely stand by it. Okay, here we go. I had said, I've been researching the difference between, say, Walter Block's view of alienability and Stephan Kinsella's, and I'm convinced that Kinsella is right. And I don't often disagree with Dr. Block. I agree on both logical and emotional grounds. And I'm glad I agree logically, because emotionally, I would not want to live in the libertarian dystopia that, in my humble opinion, Dr. Block's view entails. That would be a deal breaker for me, much like Rothbard's view of no responsibility to feed one's young children. But that's me. Your mileage may vary, but I will categorically say, if your vision of the libertarian future is that such things would be permissible, I pray to God that such a future never happens, and I don't want a thing to do with it. All right, Clayton, I hope that answered your question and that it was somewhat worth the wait. Thank you so much for your patronage of my show. And here I'm going to pimp, which I normally don't, becoming a patron, where you get to tie me in such ideological pretzels.
Boom, chicka, wow, wow.
For me to be able to continue to produce content, I need to have supporters. And that's gratefully received. I believe our libertarian view is if you enjoy something, it's worth being compensated for it. So if you enjoy the content and the work that I do, every little bit helps. And I ask that you consider becoming a patron. So now on to the news about the Big L podcast. I was with Pax Libertas Productions, and they have folded up shop. So I did get ownership of the domain, the Big L podcast, and I am going to do something with it. But I have some other ideas. I'm thinking perhaps of it being more of a Big L libertarian roundtable, not something that I am solely responsible for. And there's some people I'm going to approach with that, but it's a busy time for everybody. But that's kind of what I'm thinking. But I've always had the idea that people who are patrons of this show or that show, we kind of commingle them. So I'll continue producing the same sort of content I did on that podcast here. It's just that it's not yet going to be on a podcast speed. So that's what's going on with that. And I've also been re-uploading all of my content to BitChute because I see the YouTube yeeting a-coming, right? Maybe I'll get lucky. I haven't been zucked. Knock on wood. Yet. And I haven't been YouTube yeeted yet, but better safe than sorry, right? All right, everyone. I hope you have an awesome day. Mi guapas de libertad.
You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in the business, not because they want to